where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
They say time heals all wounds, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes the healing transforms you into someone completely unrecognizable. And that's when the real story begins. Picture this: a grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers casting golden light across nobility's finest, champagne flowing like water. And in the center of it all, a duke who once held all the power, frozen in place because the woman he abandoned has just walked in. Not broken, not waiting, not even angry, just free. And that freedom? It terrifies him more than any rage ever could. See, we've been sold this narrative that when someone leaves us, especially someone we loved deeply, we're supposed to spend our lives as a cautionary tale, a tragic figure pining away in towers like some character from a fairy tale. But what if I told you the real secret isn't about getting them back? It's about becoming so utterly, completely yourself that their return becomes irrelevant. Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. Sometimes the worst thing that ever happened to you is actually the best thing in disguise. Wearing a mask so ugly, you can't see the gift underneath until years later. Lady Beatrice, and yes, this is a real story about real nobility, though I'll protect certain details, spent 8 months in what can only be described as a living hell after Duke Alexander vanished from her life without explanation. Not a letter, not a message, just silence, that cruel and unusual punishment that leaves you questioning everything about yourself. She did all the things we do when we're broken. She stopped eating properly, stopped seeing friends, replayed every conversation looking for the hidden codes that would explain what she'd done wrong. She became a ghost, haunting her own life. But here's where the story gets interesting, where it stops being about heartbreak and becomes about something far more powerful. Revolution. Because somewhere between the crying and the waiting, between the humiliation and the obsession, Lady Beatrice made a decision that changed everything. Not to win him back, not to become someone he'd regret losing, but to become someone she'd never lose again. Herself. And when Duke Alexander saw her at that wedding, nearly a year after his cowardly disappearance, the woman standing before him was so fundamentally different that he barely recognized her. The transformation wasn't just physical, though she was radiant. It wasn't just confidence, though she had it in spades. It was something deeper, something that can't be faked or performed. She genuinely didn't need him anymore. And gentlemen, ladies, nobility of all ranks, let me tell you, there is no power in this world quite like the power of someone who has stopped waiting for you to validate their existence. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another story about getting over someone? I've heard this before. But hold on, because this isn't about getting over someone. It's about getting into yourself so deeply that you realize the enigma you were trying to solve was never about them. It was about you, about why you accepted silence instead of demanding honesty, why you made yourself smaller to fit into someone else's life, why you confused intensity with intimacy, unavailability with mystery, breadcrumbs with banquets. Lady Beatrice's story is every person's story who's ever loved someone more than they loved themselves, who's ever put their life on pause waiting for someone else to press play. And the revelation she discovered, the one that will probably make you uncomfortable because truth usually does, is that the person who broke you can never be the person who heals you. That's your job, and yours alone. So here's what I'm offering you today. Not a fairy tale where the prince returns and everything's forgiven. Not a revenge fantasy where she becomes successful just to make him suffer. But something far more valuable and infinitely more rare. A roadmap for what happens when you stop performing your healing for an audience and actually do the work. When you stop posting cryptic quotes hoping he'll see them and start building a life so fulfilling you forget to post at all. When the goal shifts from making him regret it to making sure I never regret myself again. Because, and here's the paradox that will save your life, the moment you truly stop caring if they come back is the moment you've already won, regardless of whether they show up or not. And when Duke Alexander did show up, when he tried to explain, when he asked for another chance, Lady Beatrice's response will teach you more about self-respect than 1,000 self-help books ever could. This story takes place in ballrooms and estates, with dukes and ladies and all the trappings of nobility. But don't be fooled, this is your story too. Whether you're dealing with a duke who disappeared or a regular person who did the same, whether your heartbreak happened in a manor or an apartment, the mechanics of recovery are identical. The conspiracy we tell ourselves, that maybe they had good reasons, maybe circumstances were beyond their control, maybe if we just understood the full picture we'd feel better, is universal. And so is the truth that sets you free. Their reasons, however valid, don't erase their choices. Their struggles, however real, don't justify their silence. And your love, however deep, should never require you to abandon yourself. So let me take you through exactly how Lady Beatrice went from checking windows hoping to see his carriage to walking past him at a wedding without her heart even skipping a beat. Because that transformation, that's the real love story, the one between you and yourself. Let me tell you just how deep the abyss really was. Lady Beatrice spent 3 weeks wearing the same nightgown, not because it brought her any comfort, but because changing into something else seemed to require an energy that had simply vanished from within her. The silk that once felt luxurious against her skin now hung like a shroud, a trace of the woman she used to be before that spring evening when Duke Alexander's carriage left the Ashford estate without a single word, without a hint of explanation. It's like watching a grand clock slow down until its hands stop moving altogether. You don't notice the exact moment life ceases, but suddenly everything's eerily still, and you're left staring at frozen time, wondering where the rhythm went. Her chambers became a museum of what once was, every object holding a secret she couldn't quite unravel. The leather-bound poetry book he'd given her sat on the vanity, bookmark still on page 47, where they'd stopped reading together. His favorite chair by the fireplace remained untouched, as if moving it would erase the last proof he'd ever existed in her world. The other ladies of the court whispered, oh, how they whispered, and Lady Beatrice could feel their eyes following her through the corridors like vultures circling something that's already lost. There's this particular shame that comes with having to explain to your family why the Duke who courted you so publicly, who made promises under moonlit gardens, simply disappeared without a revelation or goodbye. The obsession crept in like fog through window cracks. Lady Beatrice would send her lady's maid, Margaret, to gather information from the servants' quarters. Had anyone seen Duke Alexander? Had his estate received visitors? Were there letters she didn't know about? Every morning she'd wake up thinking today would bring answers, and every night she'd fall asleep with that same loop, playing in her mind like a broken music box. What did I do wrong? The question became her constant companion, more faithful than any friend. She'd draft letters at 3 in the morning by candlelight, pouring her heart onto parchment, only to burn them before dawn because even in her desperation, some part of her knew. Sending them would only deepen the humiliation. Here's what nobody tells you about heartbreak in high society. It's not just losing someone, it's losing yourself while everyone watches. The enigma of Duke Alexander's departure became the season's favorite topic at tea parties and balls. Poor Lady Beatrice, she really thought he'd marry her, they'd say, voices dripping with false sympathy that felt more like poison than comfort. And the worst part? She knew she looked pathetic. She could see it in the mirror. The hollow eyes, the forced smiles, the way she'd stopped caring about which gown to wear, because what's the point when the only person you dressed for vanished like smoke? It's exactly like knowing you're sinking in quicksand, but every attempt to pull yourself out just drags you deeper into the silence of your own despair. The conflict wasn't just external. It raged inside her like a storm she couldn't calm. Part of Lady Beatrice wanted to hate him, to curse his name and move forward with dignity. But another part, that foolish, hopeful part, kept making excuses for his disappearance. Maybe he was dealing with family matters too hidden to share. Maybe there was some conspiracy at court that forced him away. Maybe. The word became her prison, keeping her locked in a reality where she waited for a man who'd already made his choice, by choosing nothing at all. She'd catch herself standing at the window overlooking the road to his estate, waiting for a carriage that never came, hoping for a forbidden glimpse of the life she thought would be hers. Think about it this way. Imagine spending months building a castle in your mind, brick by brick, room by room, furnishing it with dreams and plans and whispered promises. Then one morning you wake up and the castle's gone, but you're still living in the empty lot where it stood, trying to convince yourself you can still see the towers. That's what those weeks felt like for Lady Beatrice. She'd walk through the gardens where they'd strolled together, touching the same rose bushes. Duke Alexander had stopped to smell, retracing steps like, maybe if she walked the path enough times, she'd find the codes hidden in their conversations that explained why he left. Her friends tried to help. Lady Victoria brought flowers, Lady Isabel stayed for tea, but their comfort felt like trying to heal a sword wound with embroidery thread, well-intentioned but utterly insufficient. The nights were the hardest, because that's when the mind becomes a mystery you can't solve, turning over every conversation, every glance, every moment, looking for the clue you missed. Lady Beatrice would replay their last evening together, frame by frame. The way Duke Alexander had kissed her hand, the promise he'd made to call upon her father, the light in his eyes that seemed so genuine. Where was the lie hidden? What secret had he been keeping even then? Sleep became impossible without laudanum, and even then her dreams were haunted by his face, by explanations that made sense only in the logic of nightmares. She'd wake up crying without remembering why, her pillows damp with tears shed for a ghost who'd walked away from her while still breathing. But here's the thing about rock bottom that nobody mentions. Sometimes you have to live there for a while before you realize you're tired of the view. Lady Beatrice didn't know it yet, but somewhere in those 3 weeks of unwashed nightgowns and unanswered questions, something was shifting. Like a seed buried in frozen ground, something was waiting for the right moment to crack through the surface. The enigma of Duke Alexander's absence was slowly transforming from a question that paralyzed her into a mirror that would eventually show her something she'd been too blind to see, that maybe the real mystery wasn't why he left, but why she was still waiting for someone who'd already shown her exactly who he was through his silence. The turning point wasn't dramatic at all. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, around 4 o'clock, when Lady Beatrice found herself in the village market with Margaret. Her hair hadn't been properly styled in 4 days, and she was there buying the simplest provisions: bread, preserves, nothing that required thought or care. And then she saw her, Duchess Thornfield, a woman who must have been in her 60s, walking through the square with such grace and confidence that everyone naturally moved aside. Her posture was impeccable, her eyes bright with purpose, and there was this air about her that screamed, "I answer to no one." Lady Beatrice thought to herself, "I want to be her when I grow older." And then it hit her like a bolt of lightning. Good God, she was 28 years old. She was grown. The secret she'd been keeping from herself suddenly became impossible to ignore. It was like waking up from a spell, one of those ancient curses you read about in fairy tales where the princess sleeps for 100 years. One moment, you're trapped in the fog, and the next, someone snaps their fingers, and suddenly you're conscious again, blinking in the harsh light of reality. Lady Beatrice realized she'd been living in the waiting room of her own existence, sitting there like a patient, hoping Duke Alexander would finally call her name and invite her into the life she thought they'd share. But the consultation was never coming. The doctor had left the building months ago, and she was still sitting there, clutching her appointment card like it meant something. The revelation was both devastating and liberating. She'd put her entire world on hold for a man who'd walked away without looking back. The reconstruction didn't happen overnight, and she won't lie to you and say it was some graceful transformation like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon. It was messy, painful, and happened in the smallest of increments. The first week, Lady Beatrice made herself bathe every single day. A victory so small it felt almost pathetic. But when you've been drowning in your own misery, even keeping your head above water counts as progress. The second week, she went through all their correspondence and locked it away in a trunk in the attic. She didn't burn the letters, she wasn't ready for that kind of finality, but she removed them from her immediate sight. By the third week, she instructed the household staff that if Duke Alexander's name was mentioned, if any message arrived from his estate, she was not at home. The phrase felt powerful, like reclaiming territory that had been occupied by an enemy force. Then came the anger. And oh, what a beautiful, terrible thing it was. Lady Beatrice started riding every morning, pushing her mare harder and faster than she ever had before. At first, she rode to escape the thoughts, but soon she rode because the wind in her face and the thunder of hooves made her feel alive again. The rage became fuel. Fuel to wake up earlier, to stop hiding in her chambers, to face the whispers at social gatherings with her head held high instead of bowed in shame. By the second month, that fury transformed into something more sustainable, something that looked less like vengeance and more like self-respect. She wasn't doing any of this to make Duke Alexander regret his choice. She was doing it because she regretted hers, the choice to wait, to hope, to give someone else the power to define her worth. By the third month, the habits she'd built out of spite and anger started becoming part of who she was. Lady Beatrice began accepting invitations she'd previously declined: the opera, garden parties, weekend visits to friends' country estates. She rediscovered her love for painting, something she'd abandoned because Duke Alexander had once made an offhand comment about it being a charming but trivial pursuit. She read books he would have found too philosophical, had conversations he would have called unbecoming. And slowly, brick by brick, she built a version of herself that owed him nothing. It's like when you're walking through fog and don't realize it's lifting until suddenly you can see the road ahead. The mystery wasn't how to get over him, it was realizing she'd already started without even noticing. Here's what changed everything. It wasn't when Lady Beatrice felt healed or over it that her life transformed. It was when she made a decision, a vow that felt like carving something into stone. She would never again put her life on pause, waiting for someone to choose her. That shift in perspective altered the entire landscape of her existence. It wasn't about Duke Alexander anymore, wasn't about proving anything to him or making him see what he'd lost. It was about refusing to be a supporting character in her own story, waiting in the wings while life happened somewhere else. This wasn't just recovery from heartbreak. It was a complete reconstruction of her identity, built on the foundation of "I choose me," and that choice is final. The proof came in unexpected moments. One evening, Lady Beatrice was getting ready for Lord Pemberton's ball, and she caught her reflection in the mirror. Dressed in a deep emerald gown that brought out her eyes, her hair styled beautifully by Margaret's skilled hands. And for the first time in what felt like forever, her first thought wasn't, "Will he hear about this?" Or, "Will someone tell him how well I look?" She simply thought, "I look quite striking tonight." Period. No imaginary audience, no phantom judge, just her, pleased with herself, for herself. That's when you know the codes of your old programming have been rewritten. When you stop performing for ghosts and start living for the person staring back at you in the glass. The woman who'd spent 3 weeks in the same nightgown felt like a distant memory, almost like a character from a novel Lady Beatrice had read long ago. She understood now what Duchess Thornfield's confidence was built upon. It wasn't about never being hurt or never being left. It was about knowing, deep in your bones, that your worth wasn't up for negotiation, wasn't dependent on someone else's ability to see it. The real secret wasn't hidden in Duke Alexander's departure. It was hidden in her response to it. And as Lady Beatrice prepared herself for what was coming next, because she'd heard through Lady Victoria that he would be attending the upcoming wedding, she knew something he didn't. She wasn't the same woman he'd left behind. That woman was gone. And the one who'd risen from those ashes, she didn't need his approval, his regret, or his explanations. She'd found something far more valuable: herself. There was this particular evening that changed everything for Lady Beatrice. She was getting ready to attend the theatre with Lady Victoria and Lady Isabel, standing before her mirror while Margaret fastened the clasps on her burgundy gown. And for the first time in nearly a year, when she looked at her reflection, she didn't think, "I wonder if he'll hear about this," or "Would this make him regret leaving?" She simply thought, "Good Lord, I look absolutely radiant." Full stop. No imaginary audience watching from the shadows, no phantom Duke Alexander whose approval she was unconsciously seeking. Just her, genuinely pleased with the woman staring back. And that shift, that tiny, monumental shift, meant everything. It's like finally taking off glasses you didn't realize were tinted, and suddenly the whole world looks different, because you're seeing it clearly for the first time. The transformation wasn't about fixing what Duke Alexander had broken. Lady Beatrice didn't glue the pieces of her old self back together. That would have been impossible, and frankly, undesirable. Instead, she rebuilt herself like those Japanese artists who repair broken pottery with gold, making the cracks part of the design rather than something to hide. The technique is called kintsugi, and it's based on the idea that broken things, once mended, become more beautiful and valuable than they were before. Every crack in her heart, every tear she'd shed, every humiliating moment of waiting, they all became golden seams in the new version of herself. She wasn't the naive young woman who'd believed pretty promises anymore. She was something altogether more formidable, tempered by fire and disappointment into someone who knew her worth without needing external validation. The changes were concrete, measurable, and they rippled through every aspect of her existence. Professionally, Lady Beatrice accepted the opportunity to help manage her family's estate finances, something her father had offered years ago, but she'd declined because Duke Alexander had made comments about women meddling in men's affairs. Now she dove into ledgers and tenant agreements with enthusiasm, discovering she had quite the head for numbers and strategy. Socially, she stopped refusing invitations just in case Duke Alexander might suddenly appear and want to see her. She attended every ball, every dinner party, every weekend gathering she desired, filling her calendar with life instead of leaving gaps for a ghost. The secret to reclaiming her world was simple. She stopped living as if he might return, and started living as if he never existed. Emotionally, the work went even deeper. Lady Beatrice began meeting with a wise older woman, Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore, a widow known for her unconventional views and sharp mind. These weren't just pleasant conversations over tea, they were excavations of her own psyche, digging through layers of conditioning about what a woman should want, should tolerate, should accept. Mrs. Whitmore introduced her to philosophies about attachment, about how we sometimes confuse intensity with love, silence with mystery, and unavailability with desirability. She learned about narcissistic patterns, about how some people collect hearts like trophies and discard them just as easily. This wasn't therapy to get over Duke Alexander. It was archaeology, uncovering who she'd been before societal expectations and romantic fantasies had buried her true self. Physically, the changes were just as dramatic. Lady Beatrice started riding not just for exercise, but for the pure joy of it, racing across the countryside until her muscles ached and her mind went blissfully quiet. In the beginning, she'd cry during those rides, tears streaming down her face as her horse galloped through meadows. But gradually, the tears dried up and were replaced by something else: exhilaration, strength, the simple pleasure of feeling her body grow more capable each day. She took up archery, too, something Duke Alexander had called unladylike when she'd mentioned interest in it. There was something deeply satisfying about drawing back that bowstring, focusing entirely on the target, and watching her arrows hit closer and closer to the center. Every bullseye felt like a small victory over the voice in her head that had whispered she wasn't enough. Mentally, she devoured books like a woman starved. Lady Beatrice read about philosophy, about women in history who'd defied expectations and carved their own paths. She studied poetry that spoke to resilience rather than heartbreak, essays about independence rather than romance. One book in particular struck her deeply: Mary Wollstonecraft's writings about women's rights and education. There was this passage about how women are taught to be pleasing rather than powerful, ornamental rather than substantial, and it hit her like a revelation. She'd spent so much energy trying to be what Duke Alexander wanted that she'd forgotten to ask what she wanted for herself. The enigma she'd been trying to solve wasn't about his departure. It was about her own identity, hidden beneath layers of expectation and people-pleasing. Here's what Lady Beatrice discovered. The greatest form of revenge isn't becoming so beautiful that he regrets losing you, or so successful that he feels foolish for leaving. The real revenge, if you can even call it that, is becoming genuinely happy without him. It's laughing freely again at something absurd, Lady Victoria says. It's having an entire day pass without thinking about him even once. Then 2 days, then a week, then realizing you can't remember the last time his face crossed your mind, and feeling nothing but relief at that realization. The best revenge is reaching a point where you don't need revenge anymore because you're too busy actually living to waste energy on someone who chose to be a trace in your past rather than a presence in your future. The woman who emerged from this chrysalis wasn't softer or gentler. She was sharper, clearer, more defined. Lady Beatrice knew exactly what she wouldn't tolerate anymore, what she wouldn't compromise on, what she wouldn't sacrifice for anyone. She'd learned that love shouldn't require you to dim your light, shrink your ambitions, or silence your voice. Real love, if it ever came again, would celebrate her strength rather than feel threatened by it. And if it never came, well, she'd discovered something profound. She was entirely capable of giving herself the life she wanted. She didn't need someone to complete her. She was already whole. And as whispers reached her that Duke Alexander would be attending Lord Hertford's wedding, Lady Beatrice felt something she hadn't expected. Curiosity rather than dread. Calm rather than anxiety. The codes of her old programming had been completely rewritten, and she was ready to face whatever came next without flinching. 3 weeks ago, the invitation arrived. Lady Beatrice was having breakfast in the morning room when Margaret brought in the silver tray with the day's correspondence. There, among various calling cards and letters, was the elegant envelope. Lord Edmund Hertford and Lady Rosalind were to be married at Hertford Manor, and her presence was requested. She opened it with mild interest, genuinely happy for the couple, when a second note slipped out, a personal message from Lady Rosalind herself. Dearest Beatrice, I felt I should inform you that Duke Alexander has confirmed his attendance. Are you quite all right with this? Say the word, and I shall find a reason to rescind his invitation. Your comfort matters more than old friendships. Lady Beatrice's hand froze mid-air, teacup suspended between table and lips, and suddenly the morning felt charged with an energy she couldn't quite name. The conflict that erupted inside her was immediate and visceral. Part of her, that small, stubborn 5% that had apparently been hiding in some corner of her heart, actually leapt at the news. "Oh, he'll see you now," it whispered with that old, foolish hope. "He'll see how you've changed, how you've bloomed, how wrong he was." But then the other part, the warrior she'd built brick by brick over these months, roared back with fury. Who cares? To hell with him and his opinions. It was like having two completely different women living inside the same body, pulling in opposite directions. The old Lady Beatrice, who'd waited and hoped and made excuses, and the new one who'd learned she didn't need anyone's validation to know her worth. The secret was figuring out which voice deserved to be fed, which version of herself she'd choose to be. Think of it this way. It was like having two wolves fighting inside her chest. One wolf was wounded, still limping from injuries inflicted months ago, desperate to prove something to the one who'd hurt it. The other wolf was strong, healthy, already proven to itself what it was capable of surviving and overcoming. And the thing about wolves is this: the one that wins is always the one you feed. Lady Beatrice sat there at her breakfast table, Lady Rosalind's note in her hand, and made a conscious decision about which wolf would get the meal. She wouldn't go to that wedding to show Duke Alexander what he'd lost. She'd go because Lord Edmund and Lady Rosalind were dear friends, because she wanted to celebrate their happiness, and because she refused to let his presence dictate where she could or couldn't be. That shift in motivation, from proving something to him to honoring something for herself, made all the difference. The preparation became an act of self-love rather than performance. When Lady Beatrice chose her gown for the wedding, she didn't ask herself, "What would make him regret leaving?" She asked, "What makes me feel powerful?" She selected a deep sapphire silk that brought out her eyes, not because Duke Alexander had once complimented her in blue, but because when she wore it, she felt like she could conquer kingdoms. When she sat for Margaret to style her hair, she didn't imagine his reaction. She simply enjoyed the ritual of being cared for, the gentle hands working through her curls, the pleasure of adorning herself for her own satisfaction. She went to the modista for new gloves, chose a perfume that she loved rather than one he'd once noticed, selected jewelry that made her smile rather than pieces with memories attached. Every choice was an act of reclamation. The night before the wedding, Lady Beatrice did something she hadn't done in months. She wrote in her journal, something Mrs. Whitmore had encouraged. "Tomorrow I will see him," she wrote by candlelight, her hand steady. "And I am not afraid. Not because I don't feel anything. I suspect some old echo might stir when our eyes meet. But because I know that echo is just that, a sound from the past, growing fainter with each passing day. He is not the enigma I once thought him to be. He is simply a man who made a choice, and I made mine. His choice was silence. Mine was strength." Writing it down made it real, transformed nebulous feelings into concrete truth. The mystery of what would happen when they met again held no power over her, because she'd already decided the outcome. She would be fine, regardless. Lady Victoria visited that evening, ostensibly to help her prepare, but really to check on her emotional state. "Are you certain you want to attend?" her friend asked gently, arranging roses in a vase by the window. "No one would judge you for staying away." Lady Beatrice smiled. A real smile. Not the brittle ones she'd worn for months after his departure. "I'm not staying away from life because he might be present in it," she said. "I did that for too long already. Besides, I'm rather curious to see him again, not because I miss him, but because I want to confirm what I already know, that he's just a man, not the myth I'd built in my mind. The hidden truth I'm most interested in revealing is my own reaction. Will I feel that old pull, or will I feel nothing but relief that I escaped?" Lady Victoria laughed at that, a genuine sound of admiration. "You've become rather formidable, Beatrice. I dare say he won't know what hit him." But Lady Beatrice shook her head. "That's just it. I don't want to hit him with anything. I don't want revenge or vindication or even an apology, though he certainly owes one. I want indifference. I want to look at him and feel the same thing I feel when I see any other gentleman at a social gathering. Polite acknowledgement, and nothing more." And as she said it, she realized it was true. The conspiracy she'd imagined, that perhaps he'd been forced away, that circumstances had been beyond his control, no longer interested her. Even if there were codes to decipher in his behavior, she no longer cared to crack them. Some mysteries weren't worth solving. That night, Lady Beatrice slept soundly, dreamlessly, and woke with the sun feeling more prepared than she'd ever been for anything. She wasn't going into battle. She was simply attending a wedding. Duke Alexander's presence was incidental, a footnote rather than the main story. As Margaret helped her into the sapphire gown and fastened the last button, Lady Beatrice looked at herself in the mirror and saw exactly what she needed to see. A woman who'd been broken and had rebuilt herself into something unbreakable. Someone who'd been lost and had found her way home to herself. Whatever happened at Hertford Manor, whoever said what, or looked at whom, or felt regret or indifference, none of it could touch the truth she'd discovered. She was enough, all on her own, and that revelation was worth more than any love that required her to be less than she was. Lady Beatrice arrived at Hertford Manor just as the afternoon sun cast golden light through the tall windows of the entrance hall. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it. That peculiar sensation of being watched, like a shift in the air pressure that tells you a storm is coming. She didn't panic. Instead, she took a steady breath, handed her shawl to a footman, and allowed her eyes to sweep across the gathered guests with deliberate calm. And then she saw him. Duke Alexander stood near the far window, glass of champagne in hand, mid-conversation with Lord Pemberton. She won't lie and say she felt nothing. Her stomach did tighten, a physical memory her body couldn't quite forget. But it wasn't the old knot of desperate hope and longing. It was something entirely different. The tension you feel when you realize you've already survived the thing you once feared most. The secret was that she'd already won this battle months ago, in her chambers, in those lonely rides, in every small choice to choose herself. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds, and in that brief eternity, Lady Beatrice saw everything she needed to see. She watched the precise moment recognition flickered across Duke Alexander's face, followed immediately by something else. Surprise, perhaps even shock. He was looking at her the way you look at a painting you remember as mediocre, only to see it again in proper lighting and realize it's a masterpiece. But she wasn't the same woman who'd begged for explanations through tear-stained letters she never sent. She wasn't the girl who'd waited by windows hoping for his carriage. She was a woman who'd walked through fire and emerged forged into something stronger, and he could see it written in every line of her posture, every confidence in her bearing. The mystery he thought he'd left behind had transformed into someone he didn't recognize, and that disorientation was visible in his widened eyes. The analogies that ran through Lady Beatrice's mind were almost amusing in their accuracy. It was like encountering the schoolyard bully years later and realizing they're just an ordinary, rather unremarkable adult with thinning hair and insecurities. Or opening the pantry to find that delicacy you'd been craving weeks ago, only to discover it's gone rotten, and you feel nothing but relief you didn't eat it when you wanted to. Duke Alexander didn't seem larger than life anymore, didn't cast the shadow she remembered. He was just a man. Handsome, certainly, well-dressed and proper, but just a man. The spell had broken so completely she couldn't even remember what the enchantment had felt like. Where once she'd seen enigma and depth, now she saw something far more ordinary. Someone who'd chosen the easy path of disappearance over the harder one of honesty. And then Lady Beatrice did the most powerful thing she'd ever done in her life. She smiled. Not the trembling, fragile smile of someone pretending to be fine while falling apart inside. Not the bitter smile of someone nursing a grudge. It was a genuine, warm smile, the kind you give to an old acquaintance you haven't thought about in years and don't particularly need to think about again. A smile that said, without words, "My life became infinitely better without you in it, and I know that now with complete certainty." Then she turned, deliberately, gracefully, to greet Lady Rosalind, who was approaching with arms outstretched. And in that turn away from him, she felt something click into place. The codes she'd been trying to decipher for months suddenly seemed absurdly simple. He'd left because he'd wanted to, and she'd survived because she'd chosen to. Duke Alexander remained frozen where he stood. Lady Beatrice could feel his eyes on her back, as she embraced Lady Rosalind, as she laughed at something Lord Edmund said, as she moved through the room with an ease she hadn't possessed a year ago. He was paralyzed, she realized, by the one thing he hadn't anticipated: her indifference. Men like him, and she understood this now with painful clarity, were accustomed to leaving wreckage in their wake. They expected tears, expected anger, expected women who'd been diminished by their departure. What they never expected was growth. What they never prepared for was encountering someone who'd taken their abandonment and used it as fertilizer for an entirely new garden. And honestly, Lady Beatrice didn't feel satisfied in a petty, vengeful way. She felt something far better. Relief. Relief that the power he'd once held over her had simply evaporated, like morning mist under strong sunlight. The room continued its elegant flow around them, guests arriving, champagne being served, musicians tuning their instruments for the ceremony. Lady Victoria appeared at Lady Beatrice's elbow, having witnessed the entire exchange. "Well," her friend whispered with barely concealed delight, "that was rather magnificent. Did you see his face?" But Lady Beatrice surprised herself with her response. "Honestly, I barely noticed. I was more focused on how beautiful Rosalind looks, how happy Edmund seems. They're what matters today." And it was true. Duke Alexander had become background noise, scenery she moved through without really registering. The conflict she'd anticipated, the dramatic confrontation, the emotional turbulence, simply didn't materialize because she'd already fought and won that war within herself. What struck her most powerfully in those first 30 seconds, and in the minutes that followed, was how differently the world looked from this new vantage point. For months, she'd been trapped in a prison of what-ifs and if-onlys, convinced that his departure had diminished her somehow, that his silence was a verdict on her worth. But standing there in Hertford Manor's beautiful hall, wearing sapphire silk and genuine confidence, Lady Beatrice understood the revelation she'd been working toward. Duke Alexander's choice to leave said everything about him and nothing about her. She hadn't been lacking. He had. She hadn't been unworthy. He'd been incapable of recognizing worth when it was offered freely. And the woman she'd become in his absence? She was someone she genuinely liked, admired even. Someone who wouldn't have emerged if he'd stayed. As guests began moving toward the chapel for the ceremony, Lady Beatrice allowed herself one last glance in Duke Alexander's direction. He was still watching her, champagne forgotten in his hand, conversation with Lord Pemberton apparently abandoned. There was something almost desperate in his gaze, like a man who'd just realized he'd sold a genuine diamond, thinking it was glass. But that desperation didn't move her, didn't soften anything inside her chest. If anything, it confirmed what she'd needed to know. The enigma of his disappearance hadn't been about hidden depths or concealed reasons. It had been about cowardice, plain and simple. And she'd spent far too much time giving mystery and meaning to what was really just a man's inability to be honest and brave. As she walked toward the chapel with Lady Victoria, leaving Duke Alexander standing alone in that gilded hall, Lady Beatrice felt lighter than she had in a year. The trace of who she'd been when he left had finally, completely disappeared. 2 hours after the ceremony, as guests mingled in Hertford Manor's grand ballroom celebrating the newly married couple, Duke Alexander finally gathered enough courage to approach. Lady Beatrice was standing near the terrace doors, enjoying the evening breeze and discussing literature with Mr. Whitmore, when she felt a presence at her elbow. "Lady Beatrice," came that familiar voice, slightly unsteady. "You look different. Might I have a word with you? Just a moment of your time." She turned to face him fully, and here's what's truly insane about that moment. Part of her, that ghost of 8 months ago, wanted to scream, "Yes, finally! Explain everything! Choose me now!" But the woman she'd become simply said, with perfect composure, I can spare 5 minutes. 5 minutes. For the man she would have waited a lifetime for. The secret to her power was in that number. Specific, limited, final. Duke Alexander led her to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from curious eyes, but still visible enough to maintain propriety. He'd clearly been drinking, not drunk, but emboldened by spirits in a way his sober self wouldn't have managed. And then he began to speak. About fear, about how he'd panicked when their courtship became serious, about family pressures she'd known nothing about his own father's disastrous marriage making him terrified of commitment. Words poured out like water from a broken dam. Apologies mixed with explanations, regrets tangled with justifications. He spoke of sleepless nights, of almost writing to her 100 times, of watching her from afar at social events before his courage failed. And the strangest thing happened as Lady Beatrice stood there listening. The more he spoke, the less moved she became. The mystery she'd built around him was dissolving with every word, revealing not depth, but simply mess. Human mess, certainly, but nothing that justified the silence he'd chosen. It was exactly like watching a magician reveal how the trick works. When you don't know the secret, when you're sitting in the audience gasping at the impossible, it seems like real magic. Profound, mysterious, beyond understanding. But once you see behind the curtain, once you realize it's just mirrors and misdirection and carefully practiced sleight of hand, the wonder evaporates completely. Duke Alexander wasn't some complex enigma she'd failed to solve. He was just a man with problems, legitimate problems, perhaps, but problems that countless people navigate without destroying someone else in the process. His father's bad marriage didn't force him to disappear without explanation. His fear of commitment didn't require him to leave her wondering what she'd done wrong for months. These weren't codes she'd failed to crack. They were simply excuses dressed up as reasons. When he finally finished his confessional monologue, Duke Alexander looked at her with something like expectation in his eyes. Absolution, maybe? Gratitude for finally receiving the explanation she'd once desperately wanted? Perhaps even hope that this revelation would change something, would open a door he'd slammed shut nearly a year ago? Lady Beatrice took a breath, chose her words with the precision of someone who'd learned that truth delivered. The conflict playing across his face was almost painful to witness. Disbelief, confusion, a dawning realization that this wasn't going according to whatever script he'd imagined. But surely, he started, reaching for her hand which she smoothly avoided by adjusting her fan. Surely now that you understand, now that you know it wasn't about you at all, we could— Lady Beatrice cut him off with a gentle but firm shake of her head. That's precisely the issue, Alexander. It was about me. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I deserved honesty, deserved respect, deserved at minimum a conversation rather than being left to piece together your disappearance like some horrible puzzle. Your problems, your fears, those were yours to share or not. But choosing to handle them by making me question my worth for months? That was about me, and it showed me exactly who you are when things become difficult. She could see him struggling, trying to find the right words to shift the conversation back toward possibility, toward some future where this ended differently. The hidden hope he'd been carrying, that she'd been waiting, that she'd be grateful for his return, that love could simply resume where it had been abandoned, was crumbling visibly. Lady Beatrice, please. And there was genuine pain in his voice now, the kind that might have moved her once. I know I don't deserve it, but is there any chance? Any possibility that we might— She interrupted again, not cruelly, but with the finality of someone closing a book they'd already finished reading. You had every chance, Alexander. You had chances every single day for months. Every morning you woke up and chose silence over honesty. Every evening you went to sleep having chosen your comfort over my dignity. Those were your choices, made repeatedly, deliberately. I cannot unmake them for you. The truth she needed him to understand was simple, but absolute. I have chosen myself now, and that choice isn't temporary, isn't negotiable, isn't something I'll compromise on ever again. What we had, what I thought we had, it died, not when you left, but when I finally stopped waiting. And I have no interest in resurrecting corpses. Lady Victoria appeared then, perfect timing as always, with the excuse that Lady Rosalind wanted to speak with them. Duke Alexander stood there, champagne glass empty in his hand, looking like a man who'd just discovered that the treasure he'd buried and planned to return for had been claimed by someone else, by Lady Beatrice herself, who'd realized she didn't need his treasure because she'd built her own fortune. As she walked away, she heard him call her name once more, but she didn't turn around. Some conversations are finished even when all the words haven't been said, and this one had reached its natural conclusion the moment she'd decided her peace was worth more than his proximity. So here's what I need you to understand. What Lady Beatrice learned through fire and tears, and ultimately through her own fierce determination. You are not half a person waiting for someone else to complete you. You're not a supporting character in someone else's story. You're not a museum dedicated to preserving the memory of someone who chose to leave. You are the entire story, the whole masterpiece, and anyone who can't see that, they're simply revealing their own inability to recognize value when it's standing right in front of them. The secret that changed everything for Lady Beatrice wasn't hidden in Duke Alexander's reasons for leaving. It was hidden in her decision to stop seeking those reasons and start building reasons to stay in love with herself. And that same power, that same transformative choice, is available to you right now, in this very moment. Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if it's just to yourself. How much of your life are you putting on hold? How many invitations are you declining? How many opportunities are you missing? How many versions of yourself are you suppressing because you're waiting for someone to come back, to notice, to choose you? What would happen if you took all that energy, every ounce of it that you're spending on checking their social accounts, analyzing their cryptic posts, rehearsing conversations that will never happen, and redirected it entirely toward yourself? Not in some shallow, performative way meant to make them jealous, but in a deep, genuine commitment to becoming the person you've always had the potential to be. Lady Beatrice discovered that the woman she became in Duke Alexander's absence was infinitely more interesting, more powerful, more alive than the woman she'd been in his presence. What if the same is true for you? Here's your homework, your actual practical assignment. I want you to make one decision today, just one, that prioritizes your growth over their potential return. Delete their number. Block them on every platform. Sign up for that class you've been considering. Accept that invitation you've been declining. Rearrange your room so it doesn't feel like a shrine to what used to be. Write yourself a letter from the future version of you who's already healed, telling present you what you need to hear. Do something, anything, that signals to your own psyche that you're serious about this transformation. Because here's what Lady Beatrice learned. Healing isn't something that happens to you while you wait passively. It's something you do, actively, deliberately, sometimes while crying, sometimes while angry, but always while moving forward. The mystery isn't how to make them come back. It's how to make yourself so whole that their absence stops leaving a hole. And let me be provocative for a moment. Let me say the thing that might make you uncomfortable. What if they never realize what they lost? What if Duke Alexander had walked away from that wedding still thinking he made the right choice? Would that make Lady Beatrice's transformation less valuable? Would that make her growth less real? Absolutely not. Because, and this is crucial, your healing, your evolution, your becoming cannot be dependent on their recognition of it. You cannot build your self-worth on the foundation of someone else's regret. The most dangerous trap is thinking, I'll become amazing so they'll see what they missed. No. You become amazing so you can see what you would have missed if you'd stayed stuck in that painful place. You become amazing because you deserve to live in a body and mind that feels like home, regardless of who's watching or not watching, who's regretting or not regretting. So what's it going to be? Are you going to stay in that waiting room, sitting there with your metaphorical appointment card, hoping someone who already left the building will come back and call your name? Or are you going to stand up, walk out that door, and realize the entire world has been waiting for you to show up? Lady Beatrice chose the latter. She chose herself. She chose freedom over familiarity, growth over comfort, self-respect over second chances that would never come. And that choice, that single pivotal decision, gave her something infinitely more valuable than Duke Alexander's return. It gave her back to herself. The question isn't whether you can do the same. You absolutely can. The question is whether you will. Whether you're ready to stop being the tragic character in someone else's story and start being the hero in your own. Your transformation starts the moment you decide it does. Not when they apologize. Not when they realize their mistake. Not when enough time has passed or when you've achieved enough external success. It starts when you look in the mirror and make a promise to the person staring back. I will never abandon you again. I will never make you smaller to fit into someone else's life. I will never allow your worth to be determined by someone else's inability to see it. That's the revelation. That's the codes cracked. That's the hidden truth finally brought into light. You are enough. You have always been enough. And anyone who made you question that was simply revealing their own limitations, not yours. Now, if this story resonated with you, if Lady Beatrice's journey mirrors your own in any way, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and activate those notifications, because this is just the beginning. We're going to dive deeper into the psychology of attachment, the patterns that keep us stuck, the practical strategies for rebuilding yourself after devastation. We're going to talk about narcissistic behavior, about recognizing red flags before they become relationship-ending catastrophes, about building the kind of self-worth that's unshakable, regardless of external circumstances. This isn't just about romantic relationships. It's about every dynamic in your life where you've given away your power and need to reclaim it. Lady Beatrice's story is one chapter. Your story is still being written. So subscribe, stay connected, and let's continue this journey together. Because the best revenge isn't living well. It's living so authentically that revenge stops being a concept you even think about.